In the English countryside, far from the noise and crowds of London, there was a small town surrounded by dense trees. The townspeople would often say that time flowed slowly here. Old stone houses, narrow streets, and a quiet melancholy wrapped around the souls of all who stepped into this town. But the forest encircling the town held the real mystery. No one dared enter the woods at night, for there were stories of people who ventured into the forest and never returned. Living next to a weathered church in the town center was Eliza, the last descendant of a family that had lived there for generations. A young archaeologist, Eliza had returned to her childhood town to uncover its secrets. She had heard rumors of ancient ruins hidden deep in the forest, waiting to be discovered, and this intrigued her deeply. However, the townsfolk did not share her excitement about this idea. The town's eldest, Mrs. Hazel, often warned Eliza that forest is the land of the dead. Anyone foolish enough to step inside surrenders their soul to the darkness. The whispers from within the forest steal one's sanity. Disregarding Mrs. Hazel's warnings, Eliza decided to enter the forest. Her passion for research and desire for adventure suppressed her fears. Early the next morning, she packed her backpack, taking only the essentials, and set off towards the forest. It was a drizzly morning. The air was cool, the ground damp, and a light breeze rustled through the leaves, coming from the forest's depths. Though the forest was only a few kilometers from town, a strange unease crept into Eliza. As she ventured deeper, the sky darkened and the clouds thickened. For the first few hours, she felt nothing out of the ordinary, but as she walked further, the silence grew heavier. Even the birds had stopped chirping. It was as if the forest had held its breath, watching her every step. In the heart of the forest, Eliza discovered an ancient stone structure. Moss covered it, and tree roots had broken through the stones. It must have been centuries old, perhaps one of the town's forgotten secrets. Eliza, excited by the discovery, immediately began her investigation. But the deeper she went into the structure, the more she felt the weight of something wrong in the air. A faint breeze whistling through the stone walls carried whispers, indecipherable but unsettling, spoken in ancient, forgotten tongues. As hours passed, Eliza realized she was lost in the forest. She wanted to return, but every direction looked the same. The trees seemed to shift, blocking her path. Panic began to swell within her. In that moment, she understood that the forest was not just a forest. The old stories were real. The forest had taken her in, and it had no intention of letting her go. Night fell, and darkness enveloped the woods entirely. In the mist swirling above her, Eliza saw a shadow moving slowly between the trees. Her breath caught in her throat, and she stood frozen, unable to move. The shadow whispered her name, Eliza. It was her mother's voice, but her mother had passed away years ago. Eliza, unsure of what to do, ventured deeper into the forest. By now, the path back had vanished. As Eliza continued walking through the shadows, her mother's voice echoed once again. Eliza, why did you return? She tried to find the source of the voice, but with each step, she felt more lost. The thin mist among the trees nearly obscured her vision. Everything felt like a maze. The trees, branches, and shadows all fed her growing fear. She quickened her pace, wanting to flee, but to where? There was no way out. It was as if the forest was drawing her in. Suddenly, she came upon a stone structure resembling an ancient well. Strange symbols were carved into it, symbols unlike anything she had seen before, yet they felt familiar. Instinctively, she approached the well and peered inside. It was dark, a seemingly endless void. Just then, a voice rose from the well and pierced through her. Eliza, come. This time, it was her father's voice. No matter how much she resisted, her steps drew her closer to the well, as if an unseen force was pulling her. Believing she had no other choice, Eliza thought of jumping into the well, but at that very moment, a gust of wind knocked her to the ground. When she opened her eyes, she saw a silhouette standing at the edge of the well. It was the younger version of Mrs. Hazel. What are you doing, Eliza? This is not your place, the silhouette said. By trying to uncover the secrets of this forest, you're only putting yourself in danger. But I will help you get out. Eliza, bewildered and afraid, watched the figure. Mrs. Hazel began tracing the symbols on the well with a stone. With each touch, the ominous whispers from the well faded, and the darkness receded. Though Eliza didn't understand the ritual, she knew she had no choice but to trust Mrs. Hazel. When the ritual ended, the silhouette of Mrs. Hazel turned to Eliza. "This is your final warning. Do not meddle with the secrets of the forest. Everyone must only know as much as they are meant to." Eliza closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, she found herself at the edge of the forest. The sun had just risen over the horizon, casting light through the morning mist, and the old stone houses of the town came into view. Exhausted, but alive, she questioned whether everything she experienced had been a nightmare. But the small stone pendant around her neck proved that it was real, a token Mrs. Hazel had left, a reminder of the warning she must never forget. Upon returning from the forest, Eliza decided to visit old Mrs. Hazel. When she arrived at her home, she found her sitting at the doorstep, an old leather-bound book in her hands. The elderly woman looked up as Eliza approached and smiled faintly, though the depth in her eyes unsettled Eliza. "You made it out of the forest," Mrs. Hazel said, her gaze never leaving Eliza. "You know what that means, don't you?" Eliza, confused, replied, "You saved me, but how were you there?" Mrs. Hazel interrupted her. "The forest is no ordinary place. It is a barrier that has protected this town for centuries. Behind that barrier lies knowledge no one should uncover. I and those before me have been here to ensure those secrets remain buried." Eliza struggled to grasp what she was hearing. Are you the forest's guardian?" Mrs. Hazel sighed and nodded slowly. "Being a guardian is a duty, not a curse. But it is a duty that can never be taken lightly. The spirits of the forest only become dangerous when disturbed. You found that well. Perhaps you didn't mean to, but you touched a secret." As Eliza saw the seriousness in the woman's face, a chill ran through her. "And what about me? What happens if I go into the forest again?" Mrs. Hazel gently placed a hand on Eliza's shoulder. "You've now become a part of this town. I brought you out because I didn't want to lose you. But remember this, guardians can pass their duties to others." Eliza was about to ask what she meant, but Mrs. Hazel handed her the old leather book. The cover was marked with complex symbols, just like the ones she had seen in the forest. "This book contains the history of the town and the duties of the guardians. I felt it was time to give it to you. You may need this knowledge one day." As Eliza took the book, a shiver ran down her spine. Mrs. Hazel's words carried a warning. Perhaps one day, this duty would fall on Eliza's shoulders too. "Now go rest," Mrs. Hazel said, turning away. "You must learn to live without meddling in the forest's secrets. This town will exist as long as those secrets are kept." As Eliza left Mrs. Hazel's home, a growing sense of unease washed over her. Holding the book tightly, she returned home but could not sleep that night. The apprehension she had felt that morning had now turned into a sense of responsibility. Unwittingly, Eliza had become part of this ancient duty. The whispers of the forest still echoed in her ears, but now they were starting to make sense. Eliza knew that one day she would have to return to the forest. Mrs. Hazel's words echoed like a prophecy. The time to become the guardian might eventually come for her, but when that day arrived, she still didn't know what she would do.